Hello and welcome to another Discipline Philosopher video, Ukraine War Update Extra video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce, equipped with a raspy voice. Do apologise, I'm not very well, but I will try and get through this in a way that you can understand me. Where shall I start? Well, I'm going to actually refer back to a comment by one of my channel members commenting on my sub-channel, ATP Geopolitics. This is Mitch Mezarol, talking about this video footage that I showed in my ATP Geo Extra video yesterday, which talks about, or which shows at least, Severodonetsk and this terrible, terrible situation in Severodonetsk with the city being liberated, but essentially destroyed and unlivable. It's an absolute travesty of humanity, and that's what war does. And Mitch said, this reminds me, instantly made me think of the Calgacus attributed quote, though most likely a rhetorical creation of Tacitus or another source, referring to the Romans in occupation in Britannica around 83 to 84 CE, just prior to the Battle of Mons Graupius. Sorry. He closes off a pre-speech battle with, "They make a desert and call it peace." Well, this is a really good quote. I'm going to quote you that. I'm just going to have a little sidebar now because that's how I roll. I've actually written on this. This is historiography, right? Historiography is kind of the study of historical techniques. Whenever you see an ancient book, whether it be a history book or a holy book or whatever that has speech in, anything that was written prior to the proper recording of speech in a live scenario where you can actually take down what someone says as they're saying it. So anything that happened in the ancient times, you can guarantee it is not accurate. People that are supposed to have said anything before the year kind of, like, I'd go, let's just arbitrarily pick 1600. So anything that was claimed to be said before the year 1600 was not what they said. And in most cases, it is a source saying what they said, but claiming it's kind of what they meant. So here's Thucydides, who was a historian. It was actually a more reliable historian, so better than Suetonius, Tacitus, some of these others who had like much greater issues. At least Thucydides talked about his sources and talked about the way that he put his histories together. So this is written from this is an excerpt from the history of the Peloponnesian War, and he said, "In this history, I have made use of set speeches, some of which were delivered just before and others during the war. I have found it difficult to remember the precise words used in the speeches, which I listened to myself." So first of all, he was actually there for these speeches. So that's a great luxury. Many speeches are reported where the people weren't there, so they're getting it from other sources who might not have themselves been there. Or these things were said in private rooms, and you're kind of just making stuff up. Which I listened to myself, and my various informants have experienced the same difficulty. So my method has been, while keeping so closely as possible to the general use sense of the words that were actually used, to make the speakers say what, in my opinion, was called for by each situation. As I put underneath translation, when recording speeches, Thucydides made things up that he felt fit with the overall picture. And actually, he was one of the more reliable historians. Anyway, complete sidebar there. So sorry about that, but it's just interesting. I find that kind of stuff interesting. When we talk about what Calgacus said here, he probably didn't say this, but sources are like, yeah, he meant something like this. But actually, it's a really nice bit of quote. And I'll quote the end of it, which is, "Neither East nor West can sate their appetite. They are the only people on earth to covet wealth and poverty with equal craving. They plunder, they butcher, they ravish, and call it by the lying name of empire. They make a desert and call it peace. They make a desert and call it peace. They make a desert and call it liberation." So I think, history repeats itself, or it certainly rhymes, as they say. Okay, to go to another place that is being turned into a liberated hellhole, let's turn to Bakhmut. I did a video on Bakhmut yesterday, and Richard Gilman, who it just goes to show I do read my comments. Richard Gilman says this, which is how he sees the whole Bakhmut situation summed up. And and I think it's pretty decent. The Russians have wedged themselves into an untenable political dilemma at Bakhmut. By pontificating the boast to take Bakhmut, the Kremlin must either continue to take horrendous losses in mobics and materiel sorely needed to slow Ukrainian momentum elsewhere, or ignite further domestic anti-regime fulmination if they fail. Failure seems assured. Each attempt to take ground is weaker than the previous. Winter temperatures and supply shortfalls kill, wound, and sicken more Russian mobiks exposed to the elements than the AFU bombardments. Mercenary warlord Yevgeny Prigozhin, the architect of this debacle, has already begun to absolve himself of responsibility for it by blaming lack of support from the Ministry of Defense. He has also publicly stated that it was not his intention to capture Bakhmut, but only use it to inflict high casualties on the AFU. Failure is apparently not an option proffered by the Kremlin for Prigozhin and another mercenary warlord is looming in the shadows to replace him. I mean, there's a really interesting tension between Prigozhin and the Wagner PMC and the Russian MOD and the Kremlin. I think Russia happy to see put himself about and his mercenaries to do the gritty, hard work and to offer human wave after human wave of convicts and mobilized soldiers to make some kind of limited gains. They're happy for him to do that if there's some success comes out of it. But the thing is, if it all goes wrong, if it all goes Pete Tong, then the Kremlin and Putin can just say, well, that's Prigozhin for you. What a load of rubbish. And if it goes well, he can say, well, we've used all these assets to our great advantage, Putin. So, heads Putin wins, tails Prigozhin loses. Prigozhin can move himself into a really decent position if he succeeds, and hopefully get what could be the coveted role of Secretary of Defense or Minister of the Defense in the Kremlin. But essentially, there's a utilitarian relationship between Putin and the Wagner PMC. And I think Richard Gilman here sums that up pretty well. There you go. And talking about the Wagner PMC, so the news has come out that a Zambian prisoner has died in the conflict, and it's all rather controversial. The story behind it is that a really intelligent Zambian student went to go and do nuclear chemistry or whatever it was, nuclear physics at university in Russia. And this is apparently a very, very common thing for the police to do in Russia to get their stats up, is they plant drugs on people, arrest people, plant drugs on them, and then put them away. So a black guy walking around Moscow or wherever it was, is arguably easy pickings for the Russian police. So they arrest this guy on drugs charges, even though he's like a nuclear physics student and whatnot, and they put him away where he's been in prison for some time. Anyway, this guy has ended up on the front line, and apparently Prigozhin's saying, "Oh yeah, he wanted to fight for us because he's come from, Zambia, and this is he's anti-colonial, and he can see that there's this Western colonialism going on in Ukraine." Of course, it's all a load of absolute bunkum. But this has prompted some reporting to be done into this idea that Putin is recruiting people in Africa itself. So this was actually a student who went to Russia and was recruited from the prison system in Russia, and probably may have opted voluntarily to go, but it would have been like a better way of getting out of this than serving out my prison sentence and ending up dying on the front. Here we've got the PMC going to the Central African Republic, as was Congo. So this is Russia's infamous, this is from the Daily Beast, Russia's infamous Wagner Group is freeing hardened rebels held in jail cells in the Central African Republic and deploying them overseas, including in Ukraine's eastern Donbass region. Two senior military officers in CAR told the Daily Beast. According to the sources in CAR, where armed rebels have controlled large parts of the country for about a decade, dozens of men held in military and police custody for crimes such as rape and murder are now being recruited into Wagner's local wing, which includes hundreds of fighters commonly referred to as Black Russians. Many of the recruits, the officers said, are rebels. The military considered to be terrorists because of their unlawful use of violence and intimidation against civilians and armed forces in pursuit of political aims. And so on and so forth. So these guys are being taken out to to the Donbass to fight on behalf of the Russians here and there, and there you go. It's not a good sign, I guess, for the Russians if this is what they're having to resort to go to other countries to pick up their prisoners. It means that they need boots on the ground. Okay, let's go on to something else. This is another example, and there have been so many of these. And I could give you a video of these a day. There's so many translations that Julia Davis does of heinous things that these Russian propagandists say. Here's another example of heinous things Russian propagandists say. I won't play it all, but I'll give you a taste. Okay, I'm going to start to play this interview, and I will read out the subtitles for those who are listening and not watching this, and I will play the sound to begin with, but cut that out. So, Dmitry Peskov said that the overthrow of the current government in Kiev is not one of the goals of Russia's special military operation in Ukraine. This is a direct quote. Today, Sergei Lavrov said that the Ukrainian people will be freed of their neo-Nazi rulers. Who are you for? Peskov? Lavrov? Or for Ukraine being erased from the map of the world? So he's saying to this, the host is saying to his guest, who do you support, Peskov or Lavrov, that they're not up for changing the Ukrainian government? Or are you from wiping them off the map of the world? Basically, the host is saying, do you advocate for genocide? Because these guys get to arbitrate, right, whether Ukraine exists, whether self-determined people get a right to exist as a people. And the guest says, I've said it in many conversations, not only with you, that from my point of view, as long as Ukraine continues to exist in any state, the threat to Russia will continue to exist. So he's saying that Ukraine have to go because they are a constant threat to Russia. Clearly, Ukraine is not the only one posing a threat, but Ukraine is a direct, constant threat. You can deal with Hungarians, Poles, Americans, Mexicans, or anybody else, even with penguins in the Antarctic. Ha ha ha, he's funny. But you can't agree on any. So, and this is where we're going to get into philosophy, okay? So, but you can't agree on anything with Russian people who call themselves Ukrainians, right? So the first thing is that Ukrainians are not Ukrainians. They are Russian people who call themselves Ukrainians. These are Russian people who just are saying they're something else, but they're not really that something else, and I get to dictate that. So he says he says that they are Russian people calling themselves Ukrainian on the basis of rejecting everything that is Russian. This is an eschatological enemy. So the eschaton is like the end days in biblical speak. So he's sort of bringing some biblical imagery here to make it sound as if this is just hugely problematic. This is on terms of end times, okay? And I'm sorry, I'm going to get philosophical with you now. So he says, you can't agree on anything with Russian people who call themselves Ukrainian on the basis of rejecting that everything is Russian. What this is a form of what's called essentialism. I've talked about this before, but for many new viewers, I'll talk about this again. And I talked about it before in terms of this kind of propaganda. This idea pops up, which is that there is some essence of what Russianness is in this example, that exists outside of the mind. And that if you deviate from Russianness as a human in this context, you are wrong. So if you're a human being that says, I am Ukrainian, there is no such thing out there outside of our minds that is Ukrainian. It just doesn't exist. You are a Russian person who's just got it wrong. So we need to correct you. And so this is, you see this in Catholic thought, actually, this kind of essentialism. It's called natural law. It's the idea that there is, well, it can be, like one manifestation is that you have these essences that exist, and you can talk about this in terms of biological sex, gender. Like this argument, it goes across loads of stuff. But the problem is, it's completely untenable, and I don't want to get into long grass of this, but I am, or I advocate for, because like it's so obviously true. It would be my opinion. I advocate for something called conceptual nominalism, which is that all these ideas exist in our minds, and when we agree on things, we write dictionaries and encyclopedias. But I can't tell a Ukrainian that they are not Ukrainian if they are feeling that they are Ukrainian and they are saying they are Ukrainian. This gets onto a fallacy called the no true Scotsman fallacy. The no true Scotsman fallacy goes something like this. This is one iteration of it. So you got, Douglas is speaking to Fergus and says, "Hey, Fergus, are you a Scotsman?" He's like, "Yeah, I eat porridge." It's like, "Oh, okay, but do you eat porridge with salt in?" And Fergus says, "No, I don't put salt in my porridge." He's like, Duncan's like, "Well, you can't be a Scotsman. Only true Scotsmen put salt in their porridge," or something similar like that. And it's as if Duncan gets to dictate to Fergus whether he is or not a Scotsman, because there is some objective idea of what it is to be Scottish. But of course, there isn't. You can use that with any nationality or with any kind of thing. There aren't objective, prescriptive ideas that exist out there that dictate to us certain like adherence to concepts, right? There is stuff out there with properties, and we try and muddle through life by interpreting those properties, by creating a map of reality. But we shouldn't confuse our map with the terrain, right? So when we create maths as a language to understand reality, maths isn't reality. It's our language that we put on reality. And the same way that there aren't these things out there that exist, we construct these ideas ourselves as a way of mapping reality. So we say, we've got a map. Here's Ukraine. Here's Russia. But that doesn't exist objectively. Like if all humans were to die, the ideas of Russia and Ukraine would die with us. Or with all sentient creatures in the universe who could understand mapping and understand what we've done with carving up the globe. With all sentient, the death of all sentient life is the death of all of these concepts. Now, who gets to dictate whether someone is Ukrainian or not? I can guarantee it's not two guys sitting on Russian television spewing propaganda and pro-genocide. Like these guys are saying they're not Ukrainian. Well, they say they're Ukrainian. They feel they're Ukrainian. They've got a Ukrainian language. They've got a Ukrainian culture, and they've got an area on a map they can call Ukraine. Who are you to say that none of that exists and that they effectively are Russians and exist as Russians, and any kind of remnants, any memory of Ukrainianness needs to be wiped off the face of the earth? Like, how do you get to do that? You don't get to do that. You are taking from them their right to self-determination. It's rather like we get these kind of tension. In Britain, we've had this tension where you get people that have voted to leave the European Union, right, in Brexit. But some of those Brexiteers are looking at the breakup of the UK itself, with Scotland wanting to leave the UK, and say to Scotland, "You can't do that. We're better as part of the UK. You are British." And these Scottish people are like, "You don't get to tell me whether I'm British or not. I feel Scottish, and I want to leave Britain." So on the one hand, you can't say we have a right to self-determination to leave the EU, but you don't have the right to self-determination to leave the UK. So we should be giving them the right to vote. I've changed my mind on this actually, because I'm very much pro-Britain in terms of keeping us together. I think the union is stronger. But if Scotland, on balance, want to leave the UK, they can do that. Like I shouldn't be forcing on them my own ideas of who they are, right? Who gets to dictate what a Christian is, what a Muslim is? There is no set. Like I, as an atheist, could say I'm a Christian. There's a really interesting argument as to whether I would have the right to do that. Is a Catholic a Christian? Is a Protestant a Christian? Are they both Christians? Who's got the right Christianity? Same with Islam. Sunni, Shia, Sufism. Who gets to dictate what is the right Islam and the right Christianity? And of course, There is no right Christianity or right Islam. There's just a bunch of different iterations of that we have in our heads. And when we can agree on each other, the best we can do is agree by consensus. And then, as I said, we write it down in an encyclopedia. So these guys sitting in the studio deciding that an entire nation should be erased from history is trying to prescribe their sense of essentialism on other people, their sense of an objective idea of Russianness existing, but also somehow knowing that Russianness exists, but Ukrainianness doesn't exist. So that's convenient. And how do you know this? How do you know you've got the correct interpretation of Russianness? If these objective ideas do exist, of course they don't think like this, but actually this is what they're tapping into. Like, if you think there is an objective sense of Russianness, how do you know you've got the correct sense of that? And how can you deny Ukrainianness? Anyway, sorry, it's me banging on. This is an eschatological enemy. Therefore, in my opinion, I don't know whether or not it will remain. This is a problem not only in terms of the military actions of Ukraine, this is a problem of global politics, but I believe that all efforts should be devoted to make sure that there is not even a memory left of it. Since we've communicated many times, you know that I completely and totally agree with you, says the host. So the guy has just said, the guest just says, we should eradicate every last memory of Ukraine. I've told you that many times. And the host is like, you know that I completely and totally agree with you. Two people agreeing that Ukraine should be eradicated. This is disgusting, right? But it's worth understanding what the philosophy they are tapping into is that underwrites these opinions. And it's philosophy that I think is untenable, but you will see it elsewhere. And probably half of you watching this will actually have, you would actually adhere to the philosophy they're drawing on. There's nothing necessarily morally wrong with that philosophy, but it can just be, I think, utilized for moral wrong. And here is one manifestation of that. But there will be a bunch of you out there watching this who believe in some form of essentialism, that there is the essence of being a man or the essence of being a woman, and any deviation from that is morally wrong. It's an interesting philosophical debate we can have there, but where do these essences exist? Do they exist outside your mind, or where do they exist outside your mind? Well, how do you know you've got that right? This is what in philosophy, what I call, and what it can be called, an epistemic barrier. Epistemology is the discussion of knowledge and truth. Like, there's a barrier between me, like Immanuel Kant talked about not knowing a thing in and of itself, a thing in itself, a Ding an sich is in German. So he would talk about, like, you can't know a thing in and of itself, like a laptop screen. I can't know what it feels like to be a laptop. I don't know this thing. I can only subjectively interpret it. Well, it's the same as it's the same for anything. How do I know what the objective qualities or properties of anything is if I believe there are objective, like, concepts out there? I don't believe that, because partly for these kind of reasons, you just can't know them anyway. Like man, woman, Russianness, Ukraineness, Britishness, those things don't exist out there. They exist in here, and they will vary from person to person. And you start committing the no true Scotsman fallacy if you start telling someone else that they are not a true version of this. How do you get to dictate to them what a true version of this is? So this is where philosophy and politics are, you know, being woven together here. And it's really important to understand how some of these opinions come to fruition, and what people are drawing on when they have them. Sorry if you completely disagree with what I say, but if you do, let's have a respectful discussion in the threads. Okay, this is highly controversial. So Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission president, has caused controversy today in a speech pledging ongoing support to Ukraine. Good. But spoke of Russia killing 100,000 Ukrainian military and 20,000 civilians. The clip and text were swiftly edited to remove the reference. Ukraine does not publish this data. Right. This is very interesting, because possibly she's been given an intelligence briefing that has indicated that Ukraine have lost as many as 100,000 military personnel. Remember, Ukraine claim that Russia have lost 88,000 or so. So this would be higher than Ukraine's own claimed statistics, and that they've lost 20,000 civilians? Or is this an EU guess? Is this intelligence coming from Ukraine? Is it intelligence coming from the EU? What's the EU intelligence based on? How is she regurgitating that number? It's obviously an accident, and it's now been clipped, but it's the internet. It's out there now. That's a very interesting development, and I wonder whether we can put much store in those figures. Let me know what you think in the comments. Okay, I talked to you about drones being absent recently, and then suddenly today there's an uptick in drones being counted. I think 7 drones lost from the Russians, as according to Ukrainian figures. Here are 2 Orlans, one in perfect nicks, falling out of the sky, probably electronic warfare, and the other one in pieces, but I wonder whether it can be fixed. My question to you is, or to the world, is can Ukraine use these Orlan drones again? Like, if these are cheap and cheerful but useful, they've got really long range, they don't freeze, and they're pretty usable. Can they take them off the ground, get a radio transmitter that's works with it, and use these drones again? I do wonder that. Okay, next thing is Ukraine war. BBC article here, the surrender hotline for Russian soldiers. So this is the Ukrainian government has said a scheme it created for Russian soldiers to surrender is getting up to 100 inquiries a day. The I Want to Live project was started in September. By calling a hotline or entering details through the messenger apps like Telegram, Russian troops can arrange the best way to surrender to Ukrainian forces. Apparently, they've had 3,500 contacts since the invasion began, or since it was put in place. The BBC have had some recordings, for example. Says Russian, I just don't understand exactly what to do when Ukrainians come. Do I drop to my knees or what? What do I do? How do I surrender? And the hotline says, when you're on the front line, call us straight away. Of course, being in the front line, being surrounded by bombs and bullets and whatnot whizzing past your head, suddenly calling them up might be quite difficult. But the idea is, as you'll see from this call, is it's a case of finding a quiet place. They talk later in the article about people mainly phoning at night when they get a bit of quiet time to take themselves away from other soldiers and call the hotline. Another call. I'm from Moscow. I haven't received a conscription ticket yet, but there were attempts to give it to me. Do you have the advice as to what I should do? I won't kill Ukrainians. I would like to save my life. The hotline says the first thing you need to do is apply in our chatbot. Second, if you are sent to Ukraine, you need to prepare in advance. You need to have a hidden phone to use when you're on the front line. He says in reply, I'm a civilian. I want to become a citizen of Ukraine. I want all of this to end as soon as possible. Wow. Really interesting. So that's quite an interesting article. And this is a way that Ukraine has of trying to get underneath the Russian skin to provide a way out for some of these soldiers. And it's a really valid project. So, new NLAWs. These are similar to javelins, ATGMs, anti-tank weapons that fire rockets and then go down into the tank and explode it from inside. Very useful bit of kit. That's the British, I think Swedish, so Saab and Thales have been making that together, although Thales is a French company, I think. In Northern Ireland, some of those get made. So, yeah. Good to see them there. And Gepards, Germany have promised a bunch more. Gepard, these are the sort of not quite obsolete, but certainly old school autocannons with radar, 5 kilometer range of the autocannons, 25 kilometer range of the radar, but you can network them together. And these have been really useful for shooting down the Shahed 136s and other such aerial, unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, drones. Very good. And lastly, I will read out an interview that I referenced in my frontline update. This is one of someone talking about the German provided Mars 2, which is GMLRS. Let's see what he has to say. And again, I'll read out for you the subtitles. What we see here is not a classic American or English M270. This is a German version, the so-called Mars 2. The equipment has proven itself very well. Why? Because its direct purpose is to destroy with surgical, I would say precise strikes on a concentration of manpower, enemy equipment, warehouses, refueling points, command posts. And this is the difference between Soviet-era weapons and Western-style weapons. Because we deliver surgical precision strikes with maximum efficiency at the maximum range, which according to tactical and technical characteristics is 84 kilometers. The accuracy of the system is, give or take, 7 meters. This is particularly interesting because he uses the term, this is what I talked about in a video earlier, technical range. So he's saying at 84 kilometer range, which is his technical range, the accuracy is 7 meters. The implication here is they fire it beyond 84 kilometers and the accuracy is less than 7 meters after that. But that they almost certainly are firing them up to, who knows, maybe 100 kilometers to try and eke out the most range that they can get on their missiles to hit targets as far behind enemy lines as possible. Because you can guarantee the Russians would have known this and moved their depots back to an 84 kilometer range behind the lines. But if it can hit another 15 kilometers, then they probably are trying to do that. We are working, he continues. We are destroying the enemy on our Ukrainian land. The weapons show themselves as effectively as possible. All crews are very satisfied. Because the work is maximally simple, maximally effective. It's very easy to train personnel to use this equipment. We maintain it according to the regulations, lubricating the main nodes. In principle, we have not had any repairs, thank God, and it looks like we won't need any so far. Our task was to attack the fuel tankers that had just arrived at the railway station at a specified time. So this indicates that they are getting very precise intelligence. The task was performed as efficiently as possible. 12 fuel tanks were hit and destroyed. This resulted in the maximum amount as far as we could complete the task. This resulted in the maximum amount of enemy equipment remaining without fuel for a long time. Job done. Good lad. And really useful bit of kit being used as effectively as possible. Anyway, there you go. Thank you very much for hanging out. Please like, subscribe, share. Head over to youtube.com/ATPGeo to my sub channel where all of this content will eventually be housed. And please help the channel. You can use Buy Me a Coffee, PayPal, YouTube thanks, all those things. I really appreciate that those who have done that last couple of days, you've been very kind. But of course, not everyone is able to do that or even willing. So I understand that. But thank you so much. Please take care, and I will speak to you tomorrow.